In about sometime in 1970, we were introduced to beekeeping by a man here in Eugene who invited us to come up to his home and take off the honey that he had on his hive. So a friend of mine and I, we went up there to his place. We took off the honey from the hive, went into his garage, and he went in the kitchen to get some spoons so that we could taste the honey. And it was really the tasting of the honey that gave me the idea that I needed to have a hive too. I eventually drove up to Salem and purchased a hive, and I kept it there at his place because he had a lot of property. And it was a good location for the bees. I had started another business to just make a living based on a principle that I had read about that advised that you should find a business that was recession proof. So eventually that idea materialized. It materialized in a number of ways. One was that we were both students of the Bible, and the Bible mentioned that honey as a food product 57 times. So I was impressed with the idea of how important it was as a food. And Pat and I were also introduced to the natural food industry through a friend, and we were shopping at the early natural food stores, and we just naturally became natural food believers from the simple business of using honey ourselves. And then we were introduced to natural peanut butter and tasted the difference, and tasted how much better the natural peanut butter tasted over the manufactured peanut butter, which oil was added so that it wouldn't separate. It didn't taste the same. So we even did a little bit of food storage, of buying in bulk, and Pat was, she could easily convert using the honey in the food that we ate, because she was a home economic major. So the transition of eating more natural wasn't a problem. She knew that honey was 25% sweeter than sugar, as an example. As students of the Bible, we looked at what the Bible had to say about ancient biblical foods. So the commercial food business would say, for example, nuts weren't good for you. They had the wrong oil or whatever was wrong with them. But to me, that didn't make sense. Why would God create something that wasn't good for us when it was natural, when it was part of nature? So that was really the main conflict, was that natural food didn't have a problem. The manufactured food had a problem. And they controlled the market. And we were choosing to buy from the natural food market. And we learned about from one of the original bakeries here in town, we learned about honey whole wheat bread. And that honey was a preservative for that bread. And it was a natural sugar versus, you know, high fructose corn syrup or just sugar. So that we learned about the natural benefit of honey. You know, that it contained, you know, a diverse number of sugars. Plus it had, you know, minimal amounts of other nutritional elements within the honey. And early I learned that foreign bacteria couldn't live in honey because honey is hygroscopic. So these were the bases for us wanting to go into the production of an ancient food, a food that in some sense of the word, you know, two famous people from the Bible were living on locusts and honey. Wow, that was impressive. How could you go wrong? So those are the real elementary bases for starting the business and going into it. And as a food, it was recession proof. No matter what happens to the economy, we're going to have to eat, and we're going to be more likely producing natural food. And everybody can do that. Everybody can have a garden. We had always had a garden. There was only the 1 year in Kansas that we haven't had a garden. And garden food tastes better, and it's fresh. So what happened from there and how this business got founded really was amazing. More than I could, you know, I couldn't predict anything that would happen. So there were about 5 things that happened during that first year. You know, so when I went to Portland to buy beekeeping equipment from the main dealer there in Portland, he suggested that I sell beekeeping supplies in my garage. Then there was one competitor in Eugene, and it was a hardware store downtown, and that would be my only competitor that I knew of at the time. So, you know, it seemed natural that we would want to sell beekeeping supplies out of our garage. And then I went to, in that same fall, I went to a trade show here in Oregon and met people from the Oregon State Beekeeping Association. And there I met a man who was a large commercial beekeeper, had like 3,000 hives, and he offered to deliver 200 buckets of honey to my garage at a time for me to distribute, and was already packed and processed in a 40-pound bucket of really good alfalfa clover honey from Eastern Oregon. So out of that conversation, I decided to start a distribution through Eugene's and Springfield, down to Roseburg and back up to Salem. So that happened every week on Thursday. I had a pickup, and I used to put in there the honey that I was getting from Eastern Oregon, plus any of my production. But, you know, comparatively, I was already beginning to sell more honey than I could produce with 150 hives. Because I also had a pretty large customer that I'd already been selling to, and they would take honey every week and throughout the year. And that was a company here in Eugene today that's still in business, that was one of the original companies producing yogurt. And they had a honey sweetened yogurt. At that time they were in Springfield, and subsequently they're here in Eugene. And we've been selling them for 45 years. So, and there were other customers that were, you know, manufacturing something, like the one of the main companies was Golden Temple Natural Foods, and they were the ones that were baking the honey whole wheat bread. And then eventually they made cereal, but before that they were making a bar, like a candy bar, called the Guru Chew. I still wish I had those today. They were really great. The next thing that happened was another friend, actually a pretty good friend, Christian friend, that introduced us to an idea that we should contact Lane Community College and see if they would be interested in us teaching beekeeping. So we did call them and made an inquiry to see if they would be interested. But the conversation changed when I was talking to the person there at the college who was in charge of the adult education department, and she said to me, would I consider the conversation that we were having as a business contract? And I had to answer in the most logical way that I could, you know, when she said she was willing to pay us $25 an hour to speak for 3 hours for 10 Monday nights. And Pat was a part of that because she taught how to use honey in food products. So that actually connected us. We didn't immediately realize how the connection was to the fact that we were selling beekeeping supplies in our garage, and now we had 80 students because so many people turned out for that class that they had to have me and Pat speaking in the auditorium at the school. And all of these students became customers. That caused, you know, more increased traffic coming in to our garage to buy the equipment, because I also offered them the opportunity to bring bees from California, packaged bees from California, for them to be able to put into their hive. So we started our first bee weekend, and we've had a succession of 45 different bee weekends every spring. One of those other 5 events was a new potential customer that I had yet to contact. That was really a professional, it needed to be a professional contact. And there was the second largest bakery in the state of Oregon was located here in Eugene, called Williams Bakery. So in approximately February of 1975, I made a business appointment with a purchasing agent at Williams Bakery, and at the meeting he also brought in the marketing person from the bakery, and I discussed with these 2 gentlemen the opportunity that I could provide supplying honey to the bakery for this bread of the future that I called the honey whole wheat bread. Approximately 5 weeks later, they called me back and told me they would like for me to deliver 3 drums of honey. At that time, I couldn't imagine how I would do that. But I did call my friend in Eastern Oregon and told him about this customer request to see what kind of honey he had. And he said, well, I have some bakery grade honey. That was the first time I heard about the term, bakery grade honey. And he could deliver these drums, and he was having difficulty selling this darker honey. So he was more than happy to give me a very good price that I could make a profit on selling it to, Williams Bakery. And then I had to figure out, how am I going to liquefy the honey in the 55-gallon drum that was crystallized? And I ended up making like a oven through taping this insulation board that had aluminum siding on both sides together, and putting a heater inside there and leaving it there, I think, a number of days for the honey to liquefy. And then I would have to go in and help break up the sugared part that wasn't liquefying, just with a paddle, and eventually acquired some more equipment to make that, more successful. So the last of those 5 or 6 changes, opportunities that occurred, was when a friend of ours here in Eugene brought a friend from out of town who gave us the name of the business that we have today. I'd already named the business Dick's Bee Supplies, and he said to me, rather subtly, he says, I have the name for the business. And he said, GloryBee. And I was kind of shocked, in a way. I mean, it didn't, this was not an immediate connection. I heard what he said. I didn't respond to his, like, almost like a notice, but thought about it. We discussed it, and within a week or two, it was born. That name stuck on us, in a sense, that it was, a foreign introduction, and it fit. It fit, our belief system, as well as our marketing idea. As the business began to mature, we continued to discover other opportunities to do business with people by introducing them to the products of the hive. Not everyone knows that bee pollen, for example, is the only food in the world that contains the 22 elements of the human body. I'd read a pamphlet by Felix Marat, and I discovered the truth about bee pollen. And we began to have other beekeepers that were producing bee pollen for GloryBee. There was another product that was called royal jelly. I learned about the royal jelly from different readings, and eventually found a supplier of the royal jelly, and we began to sell the royal jelly by the kilo. And it was produced mainly in China, but in Asia. And so the sales would increase, and eventually we started ordering direct, because it was a natural food, just like the bee pollen was a natural food. And it was a high vitamin B complex food. It was a miracle food because of the transformation that took place in the production of the queen. So the queen laid an egg. The bees have the ability to excrete through their glands this royal jelly to feed that one egg. And so the other bees are fed bee pollen, and they turn out to be a worker bee. But if you feed that same female egg royal jelly, it hatches out in 16 days instead of 21 days. And it is a different bee. It's a queen bee in 16 days. And goes out to mate with drones so that it can produce both female and male eggs. Early on, I consumed some royal jelly, in small quantities because it didn't taste good. But as I, again, grew in the business and started manufacturing honey to be put into honey sticks of different flavors, I decided that I would put royal jelly in the honey stick. And because I was handling all the processing and making sure that none of that royal jelly was wasted, I began to wring out the bags and consume it myself. Kind of like, well, I can't let this go to waste. So some of it went into the bucket of honey and the other part went into my mouth. And when that happened, it was helping me personally because I had an autoimmune disease that caused my body to not produce enough acetylcholine, and the royal jelly actually helps your body produce an additional amount of royal jelly. I don't know, but enough for me to find out that I could reduce the amount of medication that I was needing to take and still remain in remission. So in the first 2.5 years, what was happening more than anything else was we were making discoveries of where to buy things. And a man out of the blue from Triangle Lake came to us at the garage, showed us samples of equipment that he was making from pine boards that were actually kind of like scrap, and they were called mill ends. So he was a new supplier that was helping us supply the beekeepers who were looking for, really good sources of beekeeping equipment. So the beekeeping equipment started out to be the biggest part of this growing business. Like the sales doubled the next year and the sales doubled the year after that. That was happening in the garage, and it was, becoming too much. And there was a beekeeping very, very large competitor in Montana that was selling beekeeping supplies, and they had frames for the bee boxes that they called seconds, and they couldn't sell them. So I started buying their seconds and advertising them nationwide in that beekeeping journal. And I was selling almost truckloads. And I had to move out of the garage to a 10,000 square foot warehouse at 1050 Arrowhead Street. And, Pat immediately had a new baby. And, for a while, the two girls, our first two children, whereas even with the second one, was the first one and the second one, they were 9 months earlier than Alan. So,
what do you mean 9 months earlier?
I mean 9 years later.
Wow.
Yeah, 9 months.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Put that on there.
So, they were they were helpful to Pat when Alan was born, but needless to say, you know, she wasn't able to manage the garage to the extent of the business that was accumulating at that particular point. From after July 18th, you know, we moved and hired one or two people, whatever, I can't remember, that were working, you know, for us. And in the second half of 1977. And again, a lot of the business was it was distribution, it was selling beekeeping supplies, it was still teaching beekeeping, and you know, I used to call it my three-ring circus. You know, taking care of the bees, and I'd always go out with a helper, and then, you know, sometimes I was doing the trucking with the beekeeping with the honey, and then somebody there was always had to be there to sell the beekeeping supplies at the store, and we were, you know, ordering from a variety of suppliers, different products that beekeepers were demanding. You know, there's just a you know, whole catalog worth of stuff that you need if you're a beekeeper. And it's a seasonal business, but you know, from March through July, it's a big business. And so that's, you know, the way it was for us. And then eventually, we even, for a very short period of time in 1982, we sold the majority of our hives, not all of them, started a factory where I call it a, you know, GloryBee bee box, where we manufactured all the wooden products for the beehives and sold those nationwide. In June of 1988, we closed that down because we weren't making any money. You know, really, we were just kind of trading dollars. And so that was, you know, a difficult time. The 80s, where there was a recession in the United States, and the business almost went bankrupt. But another, you know, another banker came in and helped me get an SBA loan, and you know, I got healthy again. We bought a warehouse at 120 North Seneca. I borrowed the down payment from my Oregon dad and got like a whole new start after closing down that GloryBee bee box, and began to distribute a whole line of not organic foods yet, but natural foods. Nuts and seeds and grains, and eventually added on to that property, and we kept adding on to the different products, and then we built another warehouse in the 90s, and eventually right around the year 2000 we added to everything that we already had, we added organic products. So we had organic nuts and conventional nuts and natural sesame seeds, or sunflower seeds, and then we began to purchase organic sunflower seeds and sesame seeds. So that's the way that the business grew to the size that it was at the height of the business. My oldest daughter came to work, Regine, you met her in 1992, and she's, been with the company. And my son, he basically did the thing. I mean, he came out of college, and after an initial vacation, started working for me as a salesperson out of Seattle. So So bees are in trouble. And how did this all start? It started with the infestation of the mites. So the bees today are deeply affected by two different mites. First, it was the tracheal mite. And secondly, it was the varroa mite. I can't remember the exact year each of those started, but they were not a part of beekeeping originally. Beekeeping was much more productive, and the bees' mortality rates annually were less than 10%. Today we have mortality rates that can range, depending on the circumstances, anywhere from 30%, which is most common, to 40% or even 50%. And during the era when these mites really took over and were the most serious problem, some of the commercial beekeepers lost all of their hives. Back early in 2003, 2006, in that era. The improvements were made through various treatments, and they are by far the most important requirements for beekeeping today. So the management level for beekeepers today are the most stressful. The amount of work that it takes to keep the hive alive, particularly during the dormant season. So whether or not the hive is going to survive, it takes real immediate treatments from the bee to the bees, beginning as soon as the beekeeper can finish taking the honey off of his yearly crop. Timing is extremely important. In addition to the mite problem, the additional stress on the bees, and stress is as critical of a word in discussing the livelihood of the bee as anything. This is mostly my personal belief, is that you have, as a beekeeper, you have to do the right things in order to keep the colony from collapsing just from the stress. And And so, the due diligence is just absolutely ferocious to the work that the beekeeper has to do, the preparedness for this timing. We take the honey off the bees at the end of July, and we immediately treat them. Within 24 to 48 hours, I've got to treat those bees for the mite accumulation that's occurred from the previous treatment, which I treated in May. But we also know that pesticides are a huge problem in the health of the honeybee. The pesticides that were used when I started beekeeping were bad, but they would just kill the hive. They would just kill the field force. All the bees that were out foraging for honey would die with the pesticides back then. But the internal hive itself was not affected. Those bees could grow back, a field force could accumulate again, and the hive would survive. But the pesticides that we have today go into the colony. The bees are bringing that pesticide into the colony. The food is contaminated, and the whole hive vibrancy is stressed to the degree that the colony can just collapse from the stress of the mites and the pesticide residues, as well as the amount of forage that's available today is less and less and less. Especially in the farm areas. There's no more fence rows. There's just less and less natural flowers, like, it used to be that, I'm trying to think of the clover that was just growing everywhere in these fence rows. So the only way to deal with it is the same way that we as humans need to increase our health. They need more natural foods just like we need more natural foods. They need more healthy supplements of nutritional powders that can be fed into patties to get them through the difficult, most stressful period of time, and that exist. And they go through this stress every fall. They either make it through the winter, and they're making it through the winter by the nutritional supplement that's fed to them in a patty form, or other dry type feedings. You can't feed them a syrup in the winter because it causes dysentery. So beekeeping is a full-time job, not a part-time job. It's I take it real seriously. I've got 5 hives back there. 3 of them were producing honey this year, and the other 2 I made up for losses that one that I lost, and this year I'm going to go into the winter with 1 extra hive. And then I have a couple out on the farm near here. But, and then of course the weather affects the bees. You know, if it's cool weather, they're not going to make any honey. This year has been a much more challenging year than normal for beekeepers in this whole area, because we've had a lot of cooler weather in June, which we all like it is, you know, here at the moment. It's not, but it's there. The temperature of the high of the in June needs to be 70 to 80 degrees, you know, all day long to make the most amount of honey. And it's been well below that the majority of the day, and sometimes it does, you know, eventually get warmer in the afternoon to where they're producing the most amount of honey. And this year everything was early, and everything has stopped producing. The biggest crop, which was here in Lane County, is the blackberry bloom, and it's non-existent right now because it's all bloomed out. It bloomed out earlier because of the warmer winter. So anyway, I know that a huge amount of supply of our food is affected by the pollination of the honeybees. And I think it's, yeah, 30. It's approximately 33%, and it is essentially for the pollination of many of the seeds that we use to plant in our gardens. So some of the farmers are growing seeds just for the seed suppliers that supply the seeds for, you know, two of them that I was involved in as a small commercial beekeeper. I call it a sideliner, were grown in Madras. One was the onion seeds, and the other one was, oh gosh, how could I not remember? Onion and
barley?
huh?
Barley?
No, it was carrots.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Carrots for seed. So my bees produced carrot honey and onion honey, and that kind of honey had a different taste, not a table grade honey. That was a baker grade honey that I would mix up with the over there in Madras, the peppermint bloomed and produced peppermint honey, which was a very dark, strong tasting honey. And when you combined it with the carrot and the onion honey, it was pretty masked. Well, we produce blackberry. We call it, our honey here, Pat and I call it backyard honey. And it's mostly blackberry. But it's mixed with other flowers. And, you know, as you go with me out there, you'll see we have a variety of other flowers. And we're trying to plant more flowers that, you know, the bees like. You know, of course, we have our lavender over here, and the bees and the bumblebees are in our lavender right now.